Yes, I just had a call from my Inuit friend, Gaangats, and we were actually talking about this. And he said to me, how do you refreeze that ice up there? It just can't be done. So I went to the public library and I looked up the word hope, and I found that there are actually 14 definitions of the word hope, none of which hits you as being particularly accurate, which makes sense because it's an abstract concept. But they all come down to this idea that something good is going to happen to you. So I looked at where the word comes from, and I found it has its Indo-European root in the word koi, ki-eu. Now that is the same root as where the word curve comes from, which of course means a change in direction. I find this idea very interesting. I also find it very provocative, because I think what we see now when we look at the word hope is that what we need to do is we need to start looking into different directions. And there is another, it's not so much a definition, but it's a description of the word hope that has always been very appealing to me. It comes from Václav Havel in his perfectly spectacular book, Breaking the Peace. Havel writes there that hope does not consist so much of the expectation that everything is going to come out just right, but more the expectation that things will make sense to you, regardless of how they come out. Now, I've always had very simple ideas. They haven't changed that much over time. One has always been to write good poetry. At least to try and write good poetry, and the other one has been to pay regard to the things that are right on your doorstep. So the problems of politics and history that are right in front of you, not to turn your head aside, not to avert your face. I know that I'm not the hub of existence, that I'm meaningless, I'm irrelevant. I'm a bit of chemical scum, as Stephen Hawking puts it very nicely. Nevertheless, I spend hours every day thinking about nothing but myself. I'm absolutely obsessed, actually, with myself. It's also my favourite conversation topic. If somebody starts a conversation with me saying something like, "You are a very pedantic person, aren't you?" I immediately go, "Really? That's interesting. What makes you say that?" I could speak about that for hours. Whereas if somebody starts a conversation with me, say about the Chinese economy, for example, I have to say I'm not at all optimistic. I think it's silly to even use the language of hope and optimism. I think this whole discussion that we've been having here about hope, fingers crossed and so on, is ridiculous. It's utterly juvenile, to be quite frank. There is no point in hoping for something that is not on the negotiating table. When we look at what is on the negotiating table, the level of finance, for example, it's an insult. We are looking at $10 billion max, when we know that every credible estimate starts at $100 billion. To me, it's dangerous in a context where we know that the real need actually starts at $500 to $600 billion. To call $10 billion a success, it's politically dangerous because it creates an illusion of having addressed a very dire crisis. And I think that serious activists have a responsibility to the truth. And sometimes NGOs are governed by other parties, just like politicians are, where it's more important to claim a success, because claiming a success means that you can go raise more money, because you look positive, you look efficient, you look effective, and so on. Well, I don't think that the environmental movement should be governed by these kind of concerns, which is why I think that when something is not on the negotiating table, like the level of finance, for example, what we need to do is we need to develop strategies so it will be on the negotiating table in the future, which is why my hope is much more placed on these new movement alliances that we've been seeing forming here, because everything is so much more complicated than you think. You only see a tenth of what is true. There are a million little strings attached to every choice that you make. You could destroy your life every time that you choose. And they say that there is no fate, but there is. It's what you create. And even though this world goes on for eons and eons and eons, you are only there for a fraction of a second. And I think that the consequence of that is self-evidently that this consensus about the consensus has begun to crack. I mean, that's just a political reality. At some point, I began to cry. And that went on for many months. Sometimes it was just a few romantic tears rolling down my cheeks. But other times, especially when I was alone, it would come from deep down inside of me. And it would well up. And I would wail. therapist, and that was great, because I would go in there and I would sit down and I would start to cry immediately, every single time, and I would sit there talking about nothing but myself for 50 minutes, crying, and that cost me 70 euros. So I think that the problem is absolutely soluble. We must recognize that the anguish that we feel over what is happening to our world it's normal to feel that. It's inevitable. It's even healthy to feel that. Because how are we going to do this huge turning that is necessary psychologically and socially to create out of this disarray an exquisite, a life-sustaining, a life-respecting society? Unless we are just ready to galvanize everything. So pain is very useful. Just don't be afraid of it. And recognize that the anguish, that the horror even, that we feel over the destructions that we read about, that we hear about, it's okay to feel that. We are tough. Because if we are afraid to feel that, then we are not going to feel where it comes from. And where it comes from is love. And if we try not to feel that, well, then we numb our whole psyche. And that is very boring. So no, those feelings of grief, of anger, of outrage, they can come as you look at how this world is being trashed and its people. But that pain is just the other side of love.